we'll go ahead and be turning to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. That'll be where we'll start our study this evening, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. A couple of things we want to note before we get started in 2 Corinthians 12. I think I mentioned the other day, I'm trying to get some material together on the book of Galatians, perhaps Ephesians. We'll try to get Galatians out. If we finish 2 Corinthians, and I don't have Galatians out, and I'm not enough through working everything through Ephesians outlines to get it done, then I'll get you Galatians and work on Ephesians. If I can get them all done in time, I'll try to get them to you together, so that way we've got the next two books we're going to cover. At the pace we've been moving through 2 Corinthians, it won't take us long to cover Galatians, and so to go ahead and get you Galatians and Ephesians out, but I'm still going through. Sometimes, I've even mentioned it in class before, I look at an outline I've done, and then think, you know what, I think it breaks down better this way. And then, if I was redoing this outline, I give you I'm going back through Galatians and trying to make sure that I like the outlines we've got to follow, that it's the easiest way for us to follow Galatians. And so, I re-outlined part of the book a few years ago when I taught it, but I didn't get to teach the first couple of chapters because I was out of town when we studied it when I was in Tennessee. And so I'm reworking through the whole book to make sure we have it outlined in a way that's simple to understand. So we'll try to get it out to you by Sunday. If I don't have all the material together, I'll at least try to get you chapter 1 and some questions or introductory stuff for that. But when we start, that also depends on how far we make it tonight. We could finish the book of 2 Corinthians, in which case I'll get you Galatians stuff on Sunday so we can start it. So it depends on how far we make it tonight. Since we're quickly coming to the end of 2 Corinthians, we're not starting a new chapter tonight. Not at the beginning of class. We'll probably start one here shortly. We're not starting one at the beginning of class, but because we could very easily finish the book with 13 being so short, we're going to go ahead and review our chapter content and review our outline of the book, which we go through the outline every time, but review both of those before we get into chapter 12 this evening. The book of 2 Corinthians is Paul's ministry and defense and collection for the needy saints. It divides down into three major sections. The first of those is Paul explaining his ministry in 1 to 7. 8 and 9 is Paul encouraging generosity, and 10 through the end of the book is Paul answering his critics. The chapter content breaks down like this. Chapter 1, comfort and trials. Chapter 2, Paul's reaction to news from Corinth. Chapter 3 is the superiority of the new covenant. Chapter 4, ministers of the new covenant. Chapter 5 is the future. Chapter 6 are pleas of the ministry. And chapter 7 is comfort from Titus' report. Now, these 7 chapters are the first section of the book of 1 Corinthians. And so particularly when we start in the end of chapter 2, those very last handful of verses, 14 through 17, begins really that part of Paul defending his ministry. Sometimes in an outline, to make it simple, chapter 1 could just be the introductory chapter, or chapters 1 and 2, but for simplicity's sake, we put it together. It's really at the end of chapter 2, he begins that defense of his ministry. He defends their sufficient as ministers. Chapter 3, it's because of the new covenant. It's a superior covenant to the old. They are ministers of the new covenant. Chapter 4, here's how they conduct themselves as such. Here's why they have confidence. Chapter 5 continues that thought. Chapter 6, here's some of the pleas of the ministry. And 7, comfort from Titus' report. We sent you this message, and here's the response we got back from what we shared with you. Chapter 8, then the first in that second section is giving to help the needy saints. Chapter 9 is the attitude towards giving. Go through those, section 2 of encouraging generosity. Chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12. So we've covered 10 and 11. We're in 12. It's Paul's defense. Paul's defense is continued, and Paul's final defense. This is that section where he's defending his apostleship. Chapter 13 we haven't got to yet, but we'll go ahead and list its final exhortations. Now, just as a quick side note, when we get to the book of Galatians, particularly chapters 1 and 2, what we've seen here at the end of 2 Corinthians is very helpful because chapters 1 and 2 of Galatians is a defense of Paul's apostleship, just like the very end of 2 Corinthians. And so there'll be a lot of similarities between it. And then when we get in the middle section, it'll be very similar to Romans that we covered some time back as well. Again, we're in chapter 12. We've gone most of the way through chapter 12. We're getting ready for down in verse 14 in section 3, but we'll quickly review the first part of chapter 12. Chapter 12 is Paul's final defense, and it begins with a final boasting. Paul's been boasting, not because he wants to, we'll get to that in a moment, but it was compelled. In Paul's boasting here, he talks about two things. He begins by talking about the vision that he saw. He pointed out in verse 1 that it is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. That is, despite all his boasting, what profit has it had with those at Corinth? Well, at least their reaction to him, it has been to sort of put down whatever Paul does, right? And the reason is, we talked about it, especially those that are false teachers, if you put down what Paul does and criticize him as an apostle, then if he's not really an apostle, that means he must be a what? False teacher. Right? So they're attacking Paul as an apostle, but it's not as much about Paul as it is about going after the message that he teaches and discrediting what he teaches. So they've gone after Paul. They've put up with, those at Corinth have put up with the boasting of these, what he refers to in the ESV as super apostles. And again, I don't think he's talking about the 12 apostles, the 11 chosen by Christ, and the Matthias who replaced Judas in Acts 1. I don't think he's talking about those. I think he's talking about those false apostles that he compares himself with later on. He's saying, you put up with the false apostles, and yet you don't like when I'm having to defend myself. In chapter 11, Paul said, listen, I can defend myself alongside them about all the things, these things I've done, but then he ends by defending himself in his weakness. Well, here in chapter 12, he comes and he talks about it's not profitable for me to boast, because even though I'm boasting just like they are, you're listening to them, but you're using it, more so it seems, against me, and saying, well, listen, Paul's boasting about himself, but Paul's not really an apostle. And he's saying, I'm doing the same thing that these over here are doing, and you're listening to them, and you're putting me down. And Paul says, as we get later on in the text, there were signs that were done by me that should have shown I was a true apostle. So Paul, in giving his final argument, deals with two things. The first of those is that vision he saw. That's the man caught up into the third heaven. Now, again, there's some debate. We're not going to go through all of that this evening as we went through it on Sunday. Who is the man caught up into the third heaven? Because Paul says, I know a man, but I think it's Paul. Because Paul in that text is defending himself. And it doesn't make much sense in Paul's defense to say, listen, I'm defending myself. Listen to the visions or revelations I saw. Let's talk about John Doe over here and the vision he saw. That doesn't defend Paul's apostleship. But Paul's talking about himself in the third person. And as Paul goes on, he's saying, listen, when you hear this, I think the point is, when you hear this, what is your reaction? Well, this man must be from God. That's Paul. They hear that, and Paul's saying, that's the vision I saw, and I can boast about more. We even looked at this list here of the many revelations he had along with his vision of paradise. And Paul talks about that, but then says, that's not what I'm boasting in, but in my weakness. And he talks about the thorn in the flesh. As we talked about on Sunday morning, it's highly debated about what the thorn is. And here's a long list of things, and I'm sure you can find even more. Things like eye trouble and headaches and earaches and gout in the head and malaria, epilepsy, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, there are many different arguments. Some have some stronger case, like personal enemies. Well, that fits in the context of the book. Or eye trouble, see with what large letters I'm writing, that fits with other things we know. But at the end of the day, it's all just mere speculation because God didn't tell us. And if he didn't tell us, it's not important for us to know. And as we said, it being generic actually can help us in putting ourselves in that situation and learning from that. And that is, if Paul's problem was he had gout in the head, and we go, well, I don't have that problem, we may not be able to put ourselves in the situation of 2 Corinthians 12. But if Paul deals with it, there's a thorn in the flesh, and we say, well, here's a thorn that I have, we can put ourselves in that situation and say, listen, here's how I need to react like Paul did. Well, how did Paul react? He didn't blame God, verse 7. He prayed for its removal, verse 8. He learned to live with it, verses 7 and 8. He looked for some good in it, verse 7. What removed? He's saying, listen, in verse 7, he said it wasn't removed, but it was a messenger to buffet me, lest I be exalted beyond measure, above measure. He looked for some good in it, and he glorified in it, 9 and 10. The second section that we were dealing with when our time ran out on Sunday morning is Paul's boasting was compelled. And that is, Paul's not wanting to boast. It's not that Paul's wanting to have to talk about himself. But the boasting was compelled. Verse number 11, I have become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended by you. For in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, the New King James says. These super apostles, the ESV says. Now, there's some debate again, and we talked about this in chapter 11, and we mentioned it briefly Sunday morning. Who are the super apostles or the eminent apostles? Well, there's two sides, and there's truth to both of them by comparison. Is it the actual apostles that were chosen by our Lord? Peter, Andrew, James, so on and so forth. Well, there's truth to that he's not any less an apostle than they are. Lord willing, we'll see that when we get to Galatians. And Paul talks about that in Galatians 1 and 2 as he defends his apostleship. I think the likelier one, though, is Paul is saying, I'm not behind these so-called super apostles, and that is these false apostles. You can go back to chapter 11. Paul talks about not being behind them, I think it's verse 5. And then he goes on throughout the rest of the chapter, particularly the last section, and compares himself not to Peter, not to John, not to one of these other apostles, but to these false apostles, and says, here's what you're permitting them to do, and then you don't want to listen to me if I try to do the same thing. And here are people that are actually teaching false doctrine. There's truth in both of them. I think that's the one that fits better. And what Paul's pointing out is, I'm not behind them. You're accepting them for what they're saying and what they're doing. And by accepting them and rejecting me, you forced me to have to boast. They're false apostles, and while you accept them, here I am, a true apostle, and you're not the ones commending me. In fact, you're listening to them instead about what they have to say. Yes. I think it's probably that some of them are arguing they are an apostle, maybe not one of the original 12, but they're an apostle on the same level as a Peter, an Andrew, a James, so on and so forth, as if they're on that same level. And Paul's saying here are these so-called super apostles, right, that are elevating themselves. And so I think that's the sense is perhaps they're elevating themselves to the same level as these others, and then putting Paul down at the same time. Maybe not saying they're one of the original 12, but elevating themselves as though they're that same level. But Paul, he's not really. He's something else, because they want to be able to promote what they're teaching, and by claiming to be an apostle on that level, then they're really forcing the Corinthians, well, who's really an apostle? And if they can somehow deceive them and convince them they're an apostle on that same level as Peter and all the others, since here is somebody doing work among them, Peter did some, but not a whole lot around Corinth from what we know, then maybe they can destroy what they know about the truth and pull them away to whatever it is they believe. So I think that's probably what it is. They're trying to make themselves on the same level of a Peter or a James, and then destroy Paul to put himself below them. And that's when he's saying, I'm not behind these super or most eminent apostles, because they're elevating themselves and glorifying themselves when they're really false apostles, as he talks about in chapter 11. But going back to what he said here in verse 12, he says, and I ought to have been commended by you, but I wasn't, and I'm not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you. Now, back in chapter 11, he referred to these others as false apostles. He says, when I was among you, guess what was done? The signs of a true apostle. Paul shouldn't have to write to defend his apostleship in Corinth. He shouldn't have to come, and I think he points this out as he goes throughout the book. When he comes, he's going to deal with those who are false apostles, who are there and have to put them in their place. Right here, you're elevating yourselves and all this stuff, but you're teaching false doctrine. They're going to have to be rebuked for what they're doing. Paul's saying, listen, I shouldn't have to come and deal with that. I shouldn't have to write to commend myself. I did the work of a true apostle among you. You should have been the ones to come to my defense. When others are saying, now, Paul's not an apostle, You should have been the ones to withstand them and say, listen, here are the signs of a true apostle. And we're done, and give the evidence of that and say, he's a true apostle. What he's saying is the truth. You're the ones that are in there. But they didn't do that. And that's what forced or compelled Paul to have to give this defense by boasting. He then says in verse 13, for in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong. So he says, these signs were done among you, and with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. And what is it, where was it you were less favored than the rest of the church? And I think the point is, when Paul went to Corinth, there were signs that he was a true apostle by healings and all these other things. When Paul goes to Ephesus, guess what? Same thing. When he goes to Galatia, which also questioned his apostleship, same thing. When he goes to these other places, the same thing. And yet most of them would believe he is a true apostle, while some at Corinth, and then again I think Galatians, we'll get to that here shortly when we get into the book, are questioning his apostleship. And I think his point in verse 13 is, where were you less favored than everybody else? You saw the same evidence that they saw at Ephesus or Philippi or all these other places, with the exception of, I didn't burden you. That's a reference going back to what he talked about previously. He didn't receive support from them. With the exception of that, where was it you would be less favored to where you would say, well, he's not really an apostle? And the answer is, you weren't. And so there shouldn't have been this question. Well, Paul then, in verse 13, after he deals with his boasting, talks about his visit. Now, there's a little bit of a debate here about the third time. It's not really an overly important point as to what exactly is meant by the third time. So we're not going to spend a great deal of time on it. But there are two debates. Could third visit mean literally coming for the third time? Or perhaps the third visit be, he came once before the first epistle. He planned to come again. That would have been the second. That didn't happen. So now this is the third planned visit. Don't know. At the end of the day, it doesn't really make much difference, because what he's going to talk about going on is going to be the same, whether it's the third literal visit or the third planned visit. But he talks about coming for a third time to them. And what he says in this section, beginning at verse 14, I will list them here for us, beginning at verse 14 and going through the end, is he's first and foremost coming out of love. Here for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up their parents for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? And so what Paul points out here is, listen, I'm coming out of love. I'm not coming because I'm expecting something from you. Maybe some of them arguing Paul is coming for support. I don't know. But he's saying, I'm not coming expecting something. And he uses a parallel in their relationship as though it is a relationship like a parent-child relationship. And he says, the children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. When you're raising your kids, you don't expect your kids to turn around while they're kids and take care of you. It's the responsibility of parents to care for the children. And he's saying, when I'm coming, I'm not coming like I'm expecting something from you. He's the parent in this illustration. And I'm coming instead and being glad to spend and be spent for your souls. It's not about what you can do for me. Right? That's not what Paul's coming for. He's coming to help them and do what he can for them. And he's glad to spend and be spent for their souls. Now, the end of verse 15 says, if I love you more, am I to be loved less? That's the ESV. If you have a New King James, it says, and I will very gladly spend and be spent for your souls, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. So there's two ways it's rendered. The New King James has it as a statement. The more I love you, the less I am loved. The ESV and others would render it as a question. The more I love you, am I to be loved less? Whether it's a question or a statement, I think the point is ultimately the same, and that is, the more I love you and show this love for you, this care and concern in writing to them, and the things he's done when he's present, and the things he'll do when he comes again, he's showing his love for them, and yet the more he seems to show for them, the less they seem to show back in return. In fact, there's more questions that are raised about him the more that goes on. And Paul's saying, the more I love you, the more it seems you're questioning me, the more it seems you have, or it seems the less love you have for me. Now, verse 16 through 18, then, he comes expecting nothing. That's closely tied to the last section, but I think we'll see what the reason that's brought in here in 16 through 18. But granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? So it seems that their reaction is like Paul's being crafty. Now, the New King James would say, Paul says, I did not burden you, nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you by cunning. So it seems as if Paul's telling them, I was crafty and I caught you cunningly. The ESV says, granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. And that seems to be the idea. They think Paul's being crafty and deceitful to them. And again, I think this is one of those things being pushed by those false apostles. And that is, Paul's coming for this third visit. Well, now when Paul comes for the third visit, this will ultimately be when they take that it's collected from Corinth, right? And they're going to take it and bring it to those that are in need. And it seems some of them are acting, or some are maybe pushing the idea, Paul's coming to get that, not for people that are really in need. It's all being used really by Paul, or maybe Paul's going to sort of skim a little off the top for himself. Seems to be the accusations, because he said, did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? As if Paul's sending people to get the money, saying, well, here are those in need that need it, but it's not really for those in need. It's Paul being deceitful. What Paul does is he makes a point in verse 18, and that is, I'm the one that sent Titus to you. Now, they have established a relationship with Titus. Remember when Titus came to them after that first epistle and they refreshed him? Chapter 7 talked about that. They don't seem to be questioning Titus. Well, Titus is going to take some of it. Paul was the one responsible for sending one of the other brothers with him. Don't seem to be questioning him. I think that's Paul's point in verse 18. Did Titus take advantage of you? Well, no, Titus didn't take advantage of us. But did we not act in the same spirit? Was not Titus' reason, the motivation for coming, the same as mine? Did we not act on the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? And if they step back and take a step back, they're going to say, you know what? They did. They are. They're acting in the same spirit. They did take the same steps. So why is Paul receiving the accusation and Titus not? It all comes down to their wanting to go after the message that Paul preaches. Now, Titus teaches the same message, but Paul's the apostle. Destroy Paul as an apostle, call into question his teaching. Verse 19 then. What's his reason then for coming? Well, it's for edification. Have you been thinking all along that you've been defending ourselves, or that we have been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. You know why Paul's writing to them about these things? It's not to be tearing them down. Paul's not defending himself because he wants to bring them down. It's all being done so that they can be built up or edified. Again, if Paul's message is called into question, Paul's called into question. Paul's not an apostle. And they convince them, then those who have a faith won't be built up. Instead, it's going to be torn down. By teaching them and showing them Paul's a true apostle, that can strengthen them. What they've heard and what they've believed is the truth. And so, have you been thinking we're just defending ourselves? Well, yes, we're defending ourselves. Well, it's in the sight of God so that you can be built up. That's the reason for the defense, not because Paul's feelings are hurt. Right? There are plenty of people who would bring accusations against Paul, plenty of people in opposition to Paul. Paul's ultimately going to give his life because of his belief in the truth. But the reason Paul's defending himself is not because somebody said something that hurt his feelings. It's because of the impact those attacks could have on the Christians at Corinth. And he's trying to build them up. Finally, 20 and 21, he's coming to deal with the remaining sin. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there might be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and that I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. Paul wrote a first epistle, and Paul said, here's the problem with the church at Corinth. Right, here are a lot of problems with the church at Corinth. A good number of people listened and repented. Right? Chapter 7, you had godly grief or godly sorrow. Had everybody changed and repented? No. Paul writes a second letter. There are those who may not have changed and are being compelled for what they believe by those who are false apostles and false teachers. There may be those who they don't believe these are false apostles, but they just ignored what Paul had to say in the first epistle. Paul's writing to them again, and you need to make the changes. If you don't, when I come, I'm not going to find you how I'm going to find you. How does he want to find them? In right standing with God. And if he comes and finds them not how he wants, they're not going to find him as they want. And his point is, I'm not going to come and just be building up. Is Paul going to build up with hope? Yes, he'll build up those that are there. But he's going to have to come and deal harshly with some who are not practicing what they're supposed to. And Paul's saying, when I come, I'm coming out of love. I'm coming expecting nothing. I'm coming for edification, but I'm also going to deal with those who are in sin. Well, now the first part of chapter 13 really continues that thought. In 2 Corinthians 13, we've got our final exhortations, and there are three groups of exhortations, I believe, in this chapter. There's exhortations ahead of the final visit, or the third visit. It's the first 4 verses. There's the exhortation to examine self in 5 through 10, that middle section. And then there are some exhortations in our relationship to one another, 11 through the end of the epistle. So we want to at least try to get through these first 4 verses, and we got about 8 or so minutes remaining. Try to get through this first section as it closely ties back to the previous section. And that is, here's some exhortations for his third visit. The first is, he's just telling them, it's not really an exhortation, he's just telling them, I'm coming. Okay, I'm coming for a third visit. He then makes this statement after stating that he's coming again, which he's already stated back in verse 14 of chapter 12. Every charge must be established by the evidence of 2 witnesses. What exactly is the problem here? I don't know. Maybe it's about those who are making false accusations of Paul. Maybe it's about those who are maybe making accusations against others. But he reminds them, when an accusation is made or a charge is made, it needs to be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Right? One person could say something against somebody else for just make it up out of thin air for any reason. And if we believe, just believe what anybody just randomly says, there'll be a whole lot of conflicting information for one, and a whole lot more problems than there already are in the world if we just take everybody's word at face value. And so what he's pointing is, when there's these charges that are made, it needs to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. He then says in verse 2, when he comes, he's not sparing those in sin, which is another reminder you need to change. Verse 2, I warn those who sinned before, and all the others as I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I'm not going to spare them. Now, listen, I told you before, you need to change. And if I come again for this third visit, and you haven't changed, guess what? I'm not going to spare you again. I'm going to have to point out to you that there's necessary change. And I think there's a valuable lesson in that, and that is, we can't spare or look the other way when there are those in sin. Paul comes, there are all these people who may be doing what's right that can be built up, but there's also some people doing what's wrong, and they need to be rebuked for that because their soul is in jeopardy if they do not change. And so Paul says, listen, when I come and if I find those in sin, I'm not going to spare them. I'm going to have to deal with them. You're right, and that's what Paul does in all his teaching is even though there may be some that he's already warned even they need to change, he's not going to leave without trying to at least warn them again. He doesn't want to feel like I didn't do enough in dealing with that when there's more that could be done and more that could be said so that they change. Verse 3 now, since you seek proof that Christ is speaking in me, he is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God. Again, what's the main issue here in 2 Corinthians? There's question about Paul's what? Apostleship. Really, that means there's question about Paul's authority. Does Paul have the authority of an apostle? They want a sign. They seek some proof of that, right? Well, if you really are an apostle, give us some kind of proof. Now, Paul just talked about in the previous chapter all the signs that have been done among them. Kind of reminds me of when Christ was on this earth and he does all these miracles, and then they say, show us a sign that we may believe. Well, Paul does all these miracles here, and they have the proof that he's really an apostle, and then they say, well, we seek some kind of sign. And Paul's point is, when we come and we don't spare those in sin and we deal with them with that kind of authority, just as he points out in verse 3, look again what he says in verse 3. Since you seek proof that Christ is speaking with me, he is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. Now, Christ would have to deal with you this way if he was coming to visit you because of your sin. We're going to deal with you with that kind of authority because there's need to change. You won't prove that kind of authority he uses behind the rebuke is going to show them that he is an apostle. Now, this next section is another section that's probably very well familiar to us, and that's the exhortation for self-examination. Let's read verses 5 through 10. Examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves, or do not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test. I hope you will find out that we have not failed the test, but we pray to God that you may not do wrong. Not that we may appear to have met the test, but that you may do what is right, though we may seem to have failed. For we cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth, for we are glad when we are weak and you are strong. Your restoration is what we pray for. For this reason I write these things while I am away from you, that when I come I may not have to be severe in my use of authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down. You know how Paul can come and not be harsh with them? They deal with their sin, and that's the point he makes. If you examine yourself, you test yourselves to see if you're in the faith, and you find yourself in the faith, then you can, then I don't have to be harsh with you, but if you're not, then I will. What we're going to do, Lord willing, on Sunday morning, we'll finish chapter 13. I don't want to get into Galatians in the middle of a Bible class. That way we have some time to go through introductory material and start chapter 1. So what we'll do on Sunday morning, we'll finish this last section. Probably won't take us long. And then we'll do a review of what we've seen in 2 Corinthians. Go back through our outline in our chapter content. Is we're going to have a review. In fact, one of your last questions, I think it's the very last question in the book, is summarize the book. And that's what we'll do is summarize and wrap it up on Sunday morning. And then, Lord willing, next Wednesday, we'll start Galatians.